I got chastised for not talking about the French riots. Can you believe it? It's like, talk about the French riots. What do you want to talk about the French riots? Like, if you're from Europe, you know that rioting is a national holiday for the French people? They riot every year. Like, the year that they wouldn't riot, that would be newsworthy. It's like, oh, this is the year 2019. French people didn't riot. And people would be like, holy shit, I don't believe it. But apparently, the riots wouldn't go away. Like, it's been several days now, and the French people are still rioting. And now I'm like, okay, well, maybe this deserves a little bit of looking into. And as I'm looking into, I find very interesting things. And it's like, yeah, you know what? You're right. I should have talked about it. Because from my experience on this channel, usually when there are some mass protests or some riots going on, it's usually some agitators or NGOs that are starting the thing and then other people join. But from what I can see, these riots in France, they're purely grassroots. Like, people are legitimately pissed off with the current government and they're rioting. So, all of it started from a tax on gas. Now, most people will understand if the gas prices rises due to supply and demand reason. Like, let's say you're importing gas from Russia and Russia decides that they're going to sell you the gas more expensively. Most people are willing to put up with it. But what people aren't willing to put up with it is environmental tax placed by the government on gas, and thus making the gas more expensive for everyone. And I personally hate this type of thing that leftist governments are doing. They win the election by promising a lot of free shit to people. And you get like free education, free healthcare, free this, free that. And people vote for leftist governments. And when the leftist government manages to get into power, they realize that they can't pay for all the programs that they promised, and some of the programs might even be collapsing, so they need to take money from somewhere. And as such, they decide to tax people even further, and they come up with this bullshit. It's like, oh yeah, we're going to have an environmental tax for gas. And it's usually as an excuse in order to help combat global warming or help, like improve the climate or some shit. But when is the last time you saw a government come up with a chart and say, because we decided to tax gas, look at the pollution going down? And they would show you a graph like the year where they decided to put the tax on it, and then the graph goes down. That never happens. Do you know why? Because fuel taxes are almost never allocated to the energy transition. They just take money away from people and they allocate it to some free shit that the government promised rather than actually use it for the environment. And the reality is that the person on the street, the average Joe, doesn't give a fuck about the environment. Do you know what the average Joe really cares about? He cares about his daily routine. Most people, they have a family, they want to go to work, they want to come home, and they want to relax. And the money they make at work, they want to use in order to provide for their family. Now, when you fuck with the system that the average Joe has, when you make it impossible for him to find a job, when you make the expenses of his living so high that he can't take care of his family anymore, then the average Joe gets pissed off and goes on the street and protests. Furthermore, it seems that in France, the average Joe was outside of the overtone window. They didn't have anyone to represent them. They either had Le Pen, which, from my understanding, by talking with other French people, and I hope I'm not wrong on this, she had very right-leaning stances on social issues, but she had left-leaning stances on economical issues. And again, this alienates the people who are the average Joes, who had to vote either for Macron or for Le Pen. And an interesting fact, that this is also my opinion, is that the majority of the votes that went for Macron were votes against Le Pen. So in reality, Macron is incredibly unpopular because he didn't win due to the fact that people wanted him to win. He won because people didn't want Le Pen to win. So you now have a very unpopular president that not only is deciding to tax people, but when people go out to protest and then when they go out to voice their concerns, instead of having talks with them, instead of trying to mediate, he tries to suppress the protests. And as you're trying to suppress the protests and you're bringing violence against the protesters will also respond in violence, and you're going to get even more people on the street. And the situation has gotten so bad that apparently 2/3 of the country are now in support of the protesters. And just so you can understand how bad this is, Time magazine has titled it a civil war. Well, obviously, this is a little bit clickbaity, but when you actually go on YouTube and you look at some of the scenes that are from France, it looks really bad. It genuinely looks really bad. I want to show you some here, but I'll probably get a community strike because they always complain when you show images of actual facts that are happening in Europe. And it is astonishing to see how poorly the actual French government is managing the situation. Now, at this point, it's actually next to impossible to manage because what started from a gas price tax has blown out into a full anti government protest. And the main issue that they're having is that they don't even have like leaders that would speak for the protesters to have like a series of demands in order to actually have some negotiations at this point. When the protests started, maybe they could have just decided to take back the fuel tax or maybe just talk with some of the people from the small crowd. But at this point, the only way I can see Macron to have a way out would be to step down and have new elections, something that I genuinely do not see happening, especially when there's talks about him issuing martial law. So, yeah, I mean, this situation is just going to get even worse. Clearly, he has not learned anything. Like, if you wouldn't have brought violence against the initial protesters, none of this would have happened. But he does seem to want to escalate it even further. And at this point, again, like if 2/3 of the country are supporting the protesters, then good luck with your martial law progress. It really is a clusterfuck. And a lot of subscribers have asked me, it's like, V, whenever Antifa goes to have a riot, you never support them. Why do you support the French people? And the response is quite simple. Like, protesting has to do with a political reason. And obviously I'm biased because I have my own political beliefs. And the reason that Antifa goes to protest, in my opinion, is always ridiculous. And as such, I cannot support them. And the general public does not support them either. Like, the last year, Antifa actually rioted in Paris. And I'm pretty sure that if you would get Antifa to actually speak with a reporter and tell what they want, what their vision of France is, the average French voter, in fact, the overwhelming amount of French voters, would not want a narco-communist. They would not sympathize with it. So, yeah, that is one of the reasons why I'm against Antifa. However, in this case, you got 2/3 of the country sympathizing with these people. And I think that the government is in the wrong in this case. I think that the government needs to try to start negotiations. And if they have any sort of common sense, they would also step down. Like, there is no way to govern a country when so many people are against you and you're so unpopular in the polls. Now, regarding the issues of violence, of course I'm against it. And if it's not for the moral reason, it's also for the practical reason. Like, violence is bad for business. Simple as that. If you have a neighborhood where riots happen constantly, the insurance for the stores in that neighborhood go up. People don't want to have businesses there anymore because there's looting. So all the businesses are going to move away from that neighborhood. And there's going to be less jobs. There's going to be less people wanting to move in. And you're going to have an impoverished neighborhood if you constantly have like a riot there every single year. Secondly, like of course, I don't think anyone is okay with the looting, which unfortunately is happening. People are being opportunistic and they take advantage of the vast number of people on the streets and the fact that the police is already busy trying to suppress the riots, that they can't also make sure that they keep the peace. But there's also like people setting cars on fire. Like, this is the most dickish move that I can ever think of. Like, imagine this, like you park your car, your own personal car, you park it downstairs, and when you go the next day, you find it ablaze. And then you didn't do anything. Like, you're not a member of the government. You're not responsible for this. Chances are you probably support the people that are protesting. And, you don't deserve this shit. So, yeah, like, parts of these violence, like, of course, I don't agree with them. And I don't think a lot of Frenchmen agree with, like, setting other people's cars on fire or looting stores or that type of thing. But again, like, when you have so many people on the street, when you have like this huge number of your own citizens protesting, yeah, you're going to have to deal with the minority of people that are opportunistic and they're there to riot, loot, steal, and damage other people's private property. So the only person that I find guilty is the government for allowing it to come to this point. They should have been stopped in the beginning if they would have just talked with the people, as I mentioned, and tried to have a common negotiation. But, you know, when you look at the most leftist governments, especially in Europe, the way of them dealing with this type of crowds is to label the protesters racist or to label the protesters whatever and just ignore them. Just try not to listen to them, you know, like silence them, censor them. And this is what censorship in the end does. If you're not going to have a dialogue and you're going to be so disconnected with the average Joe, eventually the average Joe is going to take it to the streets. And it's 3rd of December, it's freezing out there. Do you think the average Joe enjoys being on the street? Of course not. So when the average Joe is finally on the street because he can't take it anymore, if you're going to get the police to beat the average Joe, to use pepper spray against the average Joe and the water cannon, then the next day the average Joe is going to come with his friends on the street. And he's going to bring his family on the street. And now you have even more people on the street. And if your solution is to again use the same tactics, then they're going to multiply until you're going to finally have to address it in order to keep the situation under control, or become so authoritarian that the average Joe is terrified to go on the street, which is what the USSR did and other authoritarian governments did in order to control their people. So it's very interesting to see where France is going to go. Are they going to take the incredibly authoritarian route and make sure that the French people are terrified of taking to the streets, or they're going to finally give in and try to have some negotiations and try to solve the problem peacefully, which is, in my opinion, what they should do. Let me know what you think. This is just my opinion on the French riots. It was very difficult to find information outside of the English sources because I don't speak French. So all I did was to try to be as objective as possible and give you my honest interpretation of the events. Really interested in seeing what French people have to say about it in the comment section.